Firstly, thank you so much for giving us this chance for doing this presentation. The topic that we would like to study is the inconsistent performance between China's A-share stock growth and GDP performance. The presentation will be divided into 4 parts. The first part is the background information about China's GDP performance and stock return. Also, we will introduce some countries to make comparisons. The second part is data analysis. In this part, we will run a regression on China's GDP and stock return to find if they have statistically significant relationship. The third and fourth parts is the hypothetical reasons for the inconsistent performance with these two figures. And now let us step into the first part. First, I'd like to give you some ideas about the concept of GDP and Chinese stock market. GDP is a measure of the total value of goods and services produced in a country or region during a specific period, and is one of the most powerful ways of measuring one country's economic performance. Chinese stock market is the second largest stock market in the world, trailing only the United States stock market, and was established in 1990s. Shanghai Stock Exchange and the Shenzhen Stock Exchange is the two major domestic exchanges in Chinese stock market. For simplicity, we will use the Shanghai Composite Index, which is SSE index, to be representative for the whole Chinese stock market. China's GDP is doing very well in recent years. In 1992, which was the first year of reform and opening up, China's GDP was only 426.9 billion USD, ranking as the 10th among the whole world, and only accounts for the 1.6% of the world's total GDP. Although at that time, China had over 20% of the world's total population. However, in 2019, China's GDP was 14.34 trillion USD, trailing only the United States in the world, which had a GDP of 21.43 trillion USD. And China has accounted for over 17% of the whole world's economy. However, the stock market in China does not perform very well. There's a huge gap between the GDP performance and the stock market performance. However, it is widely believed that the GDP and stock return should have a positive relationship because the formula of calculating stock value is the discounted value of future cash flows, and the cash flows are generated by the positive real economies. Also, the share values of companies listed in A-share index provide a key source of data for the calculation of GDP in the real economy. However, based on our calculation, this general belief has been broken. China's GDP grew even 7.56 times more than the growth of the SSE index. To make fair comparisons, we selected 6 comparable countries and regions, which are the United States, Japan, Korea, Brazil, India, and Hong Kong. This country group contains developed countries with stable growth rates, such as the United States, and developed countries with low growth, such as Japan. It also contains developing countries with high economic growth, which are similar to China, such as India and Brazil. Additionally, all these selected countries have mature stock markets, which are comparable to Chinese A-share stock markets. The comparison result is inconsistent with the phenomena we have observed, which means that there do exist inconsistent performance between GDP and the stock return in China. As for GDP, during the period of 2000 to 2019, China's GDP has increased 11.84 times, while the growth factor in the United States, Japan, India, Brazil, Hong Kong, and Korea are respectively 2.09 times, 1.039 times, 6.125 times, 2.807 times, 1.1013 times, and 1.8546 times. China definitely performed the best among these countries. However, the performance of stock index is not that good. The cumulative return of SSE index from December 2000 until now was only 44.2%, even worse than Japan with a cumulative return of 71.2%, significantly lower than the cumulative return of S&P 500, HSI in Hong Kong, and KOSPI in Korea. And for the next part, Fang Yao will illustrate the data analysis and hypothetical reasons later.
To analyze and explain this mismatch between China's GDP and Asia index performance, we run a linear regression to find the correlation between these two variables. We found that the coefficient of China's GDP and Asia index is only 0.057, indicating a weak correlation. Our interpreted function is shown here. The result suggests that when GDP increases by 1, SSE increases by 0.057. The t-statistic is 2.62, which is larger than 2, and p-value is 0.018, smaller than 0.05. So the variable is statistically significant. To explain this phenomenon, we propose two hypotheses here. The first one is that China's A-share stock market contains adverse selection problems, which means that companies that make a significant contribution to the real GDP growth in China are not listed in China's stock market. To confirm our hypothesis, we obtained data from Hang Seng China Enterprises Index, the index of the stock market performance of the major 50 Chinese companies that are listed in the Hong Kong stock market. It is observed that those companies outperform almost all of the stock listed in their home country, China. The graph on the right shows this trend. There could be multiple reasons that lead to companies choose not to list in China. First is the counterproductive IPO rules in the A-share stock market. China imposes relatively high standards for companies to attain IPO recognition. The details are included in the slides here. Companies should satisfy at least one of them. This entry requirement aims to increase the quality of listed firms, but generate adverse selection. These policies rule out a lot of new and growing companies, such as technology firms, which are predicted to achieve great success in the future. But in their current use, they have limited revenue and market shares because of high expense of research and development. A firm's stock prospects cannot be accurately or fairly assessed by only examining the performance of company before IPO. By obtaining the net profits for the 9,097 Chinese companies that are listed in Hong Kong, we have observed that 17.63% of these companies cannot satisfy the minimum requirement for listing in the A-share market. According to the figure, after calculating the stock return of companies not eligible to trade on the A-share market from the first day of listing to May 10, 2021, and minus the SSEI index given the same period, we have found that the average of this figure is 51.52%. This indicates that, on average, the companies were not eligible to trade on the A-share market outperformed the SSEI index by 51.52%.
Thank you, Fang Yao. Let's look at the second reason. The second reason for Chinese companies choosing not to list with the Chinese stock market stems from the examination and approval system, which is used for getting listed in the A-share market. In China, stock listing using the examination and approval system, while other countries have the registration system. The most differences between the two processes lies in the length of time it takes. The examination and approval system requires a larger volume of content, and so the induction process takes longer. On top of this, firms need to carry out restriction and other time-consuming process before they can join the A-share listing. And this additional task draw the process out even further. According to the data of the 2019 annual review of A-share IPO, the average waiting time for the 161 companies in 2019 was 543 days, and the average waiting time for successful companies was 531 days, in comparison to 613 days for unsuccessful ones. The picture on the right-hand side shows the summary of the duration of the examination of the list companies under the examiner results in 2019. We have divided the meeting time of these companies into 5 sections: less than 100 days, between 100 and 300 days, between 300 and 500 days, between 500 and 1,000 days, and more than 1,000 days. From the picture, we can tell that the waiting time of most successful companies in 2019 was between 300 and 1,000 days. Compared with the United States, the registration process for listing stocks through the registration system is much faster. The whole process can be divided into 2 separate parts: insurance examination and listing examination. The subject of insurance review is the Security and Exchange Commission. The main body of listing examination is the exchange, like New York Stock Exchange. Companies can do these 2 parts at the same time, which shorten the length of the review process, particular in comparison to that of the A-share market. Time is money, so the shorter review times makes many companies choose to list on Hong Kong and US stock markets. The third reason for this phenomenon is based on the different composition of investors in the Chinese A-share stock market compared to the H-share one. Generally speaking, a larger percentage of retail investors in the stock market makes the market less stable compared to the market that is with more institutionalization. The retail domain of the A-share market is almost total. The overall investor interest is easily influenced by other factors such as individual investor preferences. And as the Chinese stock market development is struggling to keep up with its rivals due to the lack of institutional investors, the A-share market has to rely on tens of thousands of small retail investors. The picture here shows the market capitalization ratio of different investors in A-share market, Hong Kong stock market, and US stock markets in 2018. For composition of investors, we found that the A-share market has the highest proportion of retail investors by 99.3%, followed by H-share market. The US stock market has the largest proportion of institutional investors by almost 93.2%. Stock markets with more institutional investors such as Hong Kong and the United States are good to improving the ownership structure of companies, and their more professional and mature investors are help to improve the overall development of the stock market. As a result, many Chinese companies will choose to list in the Hong Kong or US stock market due to this greater investor stability.
The second factor we found is high saving rate. Many people in China regard stock as gambling, and most Chinese citizens invest or save their income rather than consume. People are likely to save more money to prepare for risk and deal with emergencies, so they are more cautious and less likely to get involved in investment. According to data from the World Bank, the gross domestic saving rate of China was 44 in 2019. This is a relatively high value. Comparatively, the figures for the US and the UK in the same year were 18.2 and 16.3. China has one of the highest saving rate in the world. but Chinese stock trade value is not that high compared with the US and UK, especially when compared to the saving rate. Stock trading is obviously less active in China than in other countries. In conclusion, GDP growth in China is mismatched with its performance on stock returns. The possible reasons for this inconsistency could be rigorous IPO rules lead to adverse selection for the stock market prosperity. And high saving rate is also one major reason for the underperformance in Chinese stock market. Thank you for listening.